This is a tutorial for amphibious operations in Craig Johnson's Panzer Leader Peleliu. This is a simulation of the Marine landings on Peleliu on September 15th, 1944, and their attempt to seize the island to deny the Japanese use of the airfield in preparation for the American landings at Leyte in the Philippines 2 months later. You can see Tom Lea, the artist, who's famous for his sketches capturing the horror of war on Peleliu. This is a map prepared by Craig Johnson from the Panzer Leader, Panzer Blitz, and Arab-Israeli War game system. Each hex is 250 meters across. So 4 hexes is a kilometer. Each turn is 5 minutes. Each counter is typically a platoon. So you can see on the top left parts of the 1st Regiment of the 1st Marine Division missing one of its battalions, and then you can see the 5th and the 7th regiments just below it. Again, each stack is approximately a company. On the map, you can see the outer feature of the reef, which is very important because it inhibits the movement of certain amphibious transports, as you'll see later. You can see the shore of the map, some of which are highlighted in a light yellow, which indicates beach. The red boxed in areas are those beaches with sufficiently low gradients that they can be landed on as a part of an amphibious attack. So you can see purple, scarlet, orange, white, and amber. Ultimately, white and orange were the beaches that were selected for the landings. You can see the 2 airfields, the main one of interest on Peleliu, and then you've got the airfield at Negasabus that was never ultimately used because it was on soft ground. You can see the black line, which is the road passing to the island. You can see the mountain features, which are not really mountains. They're essentially coral hills that go up about 100 meters. They were covered in brush, and so the American reconnaissance was not able to initially detect them. General Rupertus of the 1st Marine Division distributed a letter on the day of the attack expecting the American attack on the island to take 3 or 4 days. But because of the features, the mountain features, which the Japanese had used to build massive cave fortifications, were not seen by air reconnaissance until after the trees and the brush were wiped away by the bombardment. The actual fight on Peleliu lasted 3 months. You can see other types of terrain, such as the airfield, the marshes, forests, and you can see various inhabited areas. You can see the road in the form of a causeway crossing from Peleliu to Negasabus Island as well. Here's a zoom in on the airfield and the Umurbrogol mountains, which was ultimately the main feature of the combat. The scenario that's covered here is the initial landing, which lasts essentially 4 hours. From 0800 on the 15th of September until noon. The first LTV that you can see there in the bottom left landed at 0832 hours, and the Marines suspended operations at noon, 1200, because the temperature had risen to 115 degrees or 46 degrees Celsius, and there was a severe shortage of water, and heat, prostration, and dehydration casualties were exceeding combat casualties. Here you can see a better view of the airfield in relationship to white and orange beaches, which is where the Marines chose to land, not only because of the gradient, but because it was relatively clear terrain, and it was a wide, flat beach, and it was proximate to the airfield. Here's a closer look at white and orange beaches where parts of the 3 Marine regiments, the 1st, 5th, and 7th, landed. Purple was one of the possible beach landing areas, Ultimately, the U.S. chose not to land there because immediately past the beach is a swamp on both sides of the path that you can see there. Whereas in Panzer Blitz, the defender gets a bonus for being deployed in a swamp, and it's not traversable by armored vehicles, so it has some defensive advantage. In this simulation, um, troops deployed in a swamp actually have a negative modifier, or rather a positive modifier, to being attacked because of the general exposure. This is another possible beach landing area. The reason these were possibilities is because the American LST can land on a beach if it's in the same hex with a reef, because the LST then doesn't have to cross over the reef. However, both Purple Beach and Scarlet Beach are relatively entrapped by the terrain. If soldiers were to land on the beach, they could be easily bottlenecked to try and get off the beach. So ultimately, no landings were made in Purple or Scarlet Beach. You can see here Unnamed Island, which is important because it had fortifications that allowed the Japanese to enfilade the orange and white beaches. This is a very long beach, but because of the again, it was some distance from the airfield, and so ultimately the Marines chose not to land here, despite the fact that there were excellent beaches. So here's an overview of the Umurbrogol Mountains. You can see a map of it in the bottom left, and the type of features that the coral rock created in the center. On the top left is a sketch of the most elaborate fortification that was constructed by the Japanese in these mountains. The depth of the fortifications were sufficient to stop all indirect fire bombardment, and so ultimately the Marines and then the Army had to bring artillery pieces for direct fire attacks on the entrances to these caves. Here you can see the causeway leading onto Negasebus Island. Sherman tanks crossed over that reef, and 3 of them fell into holes in the reef, showing the difficulty and danger of crossing reefs in heavy armored vehicles. So on the left, you can see the complete organization in form of counters of 1 Marine battalion. There are 3 Marine regiments, each with 3 battalions, and so there's a total of 9 battalions. So the 3 leftmost columns are each of the separate companies, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd companies. And each company has, going from top to bottom, 3 platoons of U.S. Marine Corps infantry. Normally the value is 4 in terms of firepower, which is the top left number, but here it's 8, representing the heavy use of flamethrowers and explosives to attack the Japanese entrenchments. This 1st Marine Division had already fought at Guadalcanal, so it was experienced. It knew the sounds of the enemy's weapons, so when they're fired at and they go into contact, they're able to fairly accurately describe what kind of enemy they're fighting. You can see heavy weapons that are then below it, a platoon of heavy, 2 platoons of, rather a platoon of heavy weapons followed by a section of headquarters heavy weapons. These are in the form of heavy machine guns. Then you've got an anti-tank detachment, which are the bazooka teams. Then you've got a 60mm mortar and a jeep. So the stacking limit in this version of Panzer Leader is 4 platoons per hex. But because of the high density permitted by the terrain, such as the rocky reefs, this game actually allows a stacking of 8, which is 4 infantry and then 4 weapons and vehicles, essentially not infantry. Any greater numbers of density than that incurs a -1 beneficial modifier to the attacker because of the high density on the hex. And because of the clear terrain on airfields and on beaches, that negative is also in effect. And so there's a high incentive for the Marines once they land to get off the beach as quickly as possible. In the rules, they're not allowed to conduct close assault tactics because of the exposure of the beach. They're not able to approach any target through infiltration before conducting a close attack with explosives, grenades, and flamethrowers. So there are 3 companies. Each of the companies is differentiated also by their level of morale, which is a measures the level of losses, their ammo state, and there's also a signal state for the overall battalion. So on the extreme right, you can see the headquarters platoon, heavy machine gun section. The 3 sections are the equivalent of a platoon, anti-tank platoon, a supply platoon, which has its own rules. There was a very heavy dependence, diversion in fact, of LTVs bringing supplies in and then bringing casualties out. And so you're not looking at more than 80% efficiency in terms of the use of the LTVs. There's a signals platoon. This is very important because there were numerous instances of battalions and regiments losing their signals equipment on their way into the beach and then not being able to call in naval artillery fire or air support. And this is a critical lacunae of the amphibious attack. And then you can see the 3 81mm mortar platoons. So the frontage for a single battalion in Panzer Blitz is actually a little bit more than it was historically, but not too much more. And so you're looking at approximately 2 hexes or a 500-meter width beach landing for each company and all of its support elements. On the right, you can see the 1st Marine Tank Battalion, of which 2/3 were available in the actual conflict. 1/3 were not deployed. The Zippos in the center are, of course, the flamethrower-equipped tanks, and then you've got an armored recovery vehicle. There are a great many utility vehicles on the beach, but they're treated generically as vehicles facilitating the landings at the speed at which landings occur in this game. But the armored recovery vehicle is important because it can actually rather put back into action those platoons that were damaged. And most of the armored platoons that were damaged were mobility hits. And so the ARV is able to get those vehicles back in operation. Obviously, the miraculous thing of Peleliu is the Marines were able to land armor for the first time within just a few hours of the initial landing. This had never been done before, and it was done by landing the tanks on the edge of the reef, and then LTVs were slowly leading them in by essentially picking spots on the reef that didn't have huge holes in them or huge potholes that would have had the tanks drop into them. And near as I can tell from my research, no tanks were lost in that almost 800-meter drive from the reef edge to the beach. On the left, you can see the different artillery batteries. 155 millimeter long toms, 105 millimeters, and 75 meters. The command post actually represents the divisional headquarters. There are no regimental headquarters. They're sort of integrated in the functionality of the game. Most of the fire control and fire requests go through the headquarters and the signals platoons for each of the 9 battalions. You can see the 2 aircraft that represent approximately squadron-sized air support, one dropping napalm and the other dropping rockets. You can see the 2 truck platoons that were attached to the artillery that ultimately did land, and the 3 platoons of military police that were responsible for traffic control. So I integrate them with the beach commanders in terms of increasing the mobility of those marine elements that are getting off the beach. Very important are, of course, the engineers on the right, of which there are 3 varieties. Pioneers, who do construction, combat, who do construction and combat, and then finally the assault engineers, who are exclusively engaged in assault. In the rules, there's a great many functions that the pioneers and the engineers in general do, but for the purposes of amphibious landings, the first function they have is to prepare reef hexes, and it takes 1 platoon of engineers 12 turns of 5 minutes or 1 hour to prepare 1 hex of reef for landing. And this is important because a great many of the amphibious vehicles cannot debark their passengers, personnel and vehicles without the reef being prepared so that the vehicles don't get stuck on the reef. These pioneers can actually extend the reef preparation all the way to the shore, but it does take a very long time. And a secondary function is the building of a causeway, although the construction of a causeway took several days, although it did facilitate the offloading of vehicles. There's, of course, the offshore bombardment support. This is heavily dependent on communications, which is covered in the rules. It's substantial, but ultimately there were very few Japanese losses caused by artillery bombardment, because the Japanese had put most of their military forces in fortifications and deep within caves. The setup the Japanese had for their artillery was that their artillery could be towed out from the fortifications, could fire, and then could go back. In the game system, because of that fragmentation, Japanese artillery cannot conduct conjoined operations and concentrate on a target unless the artillery units are adjacent. And that assumes the Japanese still have their functioning signals platoons. Now, the purpose of this tutorial is to guide the student on how to conduct amphibious operations using the counters available in Panzer Leader Peleliu. Now, there's a number of different vehicles, and they all have very different characteristics. Looking at the left, starting at the top, we have LSDs. These are landing ship docks. They're very large vessels that contain large numbers of other landing vehicles. These are large ships. They're very vulnerable, and so they don't approach the shore and they don't come on the map. These counters indicate the map edge where the resources and the landing vehicles from the LSDs come onto the map. Below them are 4 LSTs, landing ship tanks. These are large armed vessels that could land on a beach, and then their nose would open and vehicles could come out. This is the main system that the Marines used to land artillery onto the beaches of Peleliu, as well as tanks. Below that are ducks. These are army vehicles optimized for river crossings. They're essentially amphibious trucks, and there were a significant number of them deployed at Peleliu. They're not as rugged as landing vehicle tracks because they're wheeled, and so they could follow the path of an LVT. Normally, of course, they're very fast on the roads, but in Peleliu, they were vulnerable to the mines on the beach and less versatile than the tracked landers. Then there's LCVP, Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, which is also known as a Higgins boat. It's what we think of as a landing craft when you think of landings at places like Anzio and the D-Day landings Operation Overlord in Normandy. These carried personnel and sort of closed in flat-bottomed vessels that could cross a reef, and then the ramp would come down and the soldiers would come out. At the bottom, you can see the Landing Vehicle Tract, LVT. And, of course, there's a number of different varieties. The varieties I've shown here are the ones that had turrets. The vast majority of them did not have turrets. There was an LVT-2 variant and an LVT-4 variant without turrets, and they're technically indistinguishable in the game. And then finally on the right we have 8 LCIs, Landing Craft Infantry, and you can see one of those ships depicted in the center. This ship could not cross a reef, but it could land troops onto the reef edge if the reef edge had been prepared by the engineers so that the LCI did not become trapped. One of the advantages of the LCI is that they were very heavily armed. And so immediately after disgorging their infantry, they then went to the sides of the landing beaches and provided fire support. So using these 6 different instruments of amphibious landing, the player is able to get the Marines onto the shore in order to conduct their mission. And knowing the strengths and weaknesses of each of these systems is very important in order to have an integrated landing package. So on the top left you can see the LVT-2s, and on the right you can see the LVT-4s. So an individual LST has 2 loadouts. It either carries 40 LVT-2s or 44 ducks. Now in game terms, each counter is a platoon and is approximately 4 vehicles, 4 LVT-2s or 4 LVT-4s or 4 ducks. And so the 2 configurations are either 10 LVT-2s or LVT-4s on an LSD, or 6 ducks and 5 LVT-2s or 5 LVT-4s. So here you can see the landing ship dock that was used in the Pacific. And you can see an LVT-2 coming off of a ramp at the back of a landing ship dock. Another instrument is the LST, the Landing Ship Tank. This is typical of a large ship type lander that lands on the beach. It's able to disgorge its vehicles and then pull off the beach with its powerful propellers. Now, very often, because of the timing of when the ship lands, because they could land when it's high tide or low tide, by the time they disgorged, the water had displaced and the LSTs would have to wait until the tides returned for the ship to be able to get the propeller power to pull out. However, it's it is an armed ship, but it's very large and therefore very vulnerable. And so at Peleliu, these were not landed on the island. To the north of the island, at Purple Beach, where the reef edge coincides with the beach, engineers can prepare those hexes for landing so that the LST can land. But in this simulation, even if they land there, they're not able to push off without tractors. And so they would land and then be stuck there and vulnerable to artillery attack. Ultimately, the LSTs landed on the reef edge on hexes prepared by the engineers, and this was the principal means by which armored vehicles, the Sherman tanks, and artillery were able to come ashore. So the loadout for an LST is 3 armored platoons, 5 vehicles, or 5 of anything. In other words, 5 troops of artillery, 5 platoons of artillery, and then 4 platoons of infantry. So here's another loadout variation for an LST. So here you've got M3 half tracks instead of the tanks, and you've got the wheeled vehicles. But again, those wheeled vehicles can be replaced by artillery, in form of howitzers, guns, and mortars. So these are the different possible loadouts for the other landing vehicles. Starting from the top left, you've got the landing craft infantry. It can carry up to 4 platoons of infantry. In this case, we've got Pioneer engineers, and it's assumed that these engineers are carrying the tools and some of the materials they need to do construction on the island. A duck can carry 3 platoons. So again, you can sort of calculate it out. Each counter represents 4 ducks. An LVT-2 or an LVT-4 can carry 2 platoons. An LVT-2 can also carry, instead of 2 platoons, it can carry 1 platoon of vehicles, or specifically jeeps. An LVT-2 can also carry a single anti-tank gun. Now, there is a separate rule, which is an LVT can tow an artillery piece dropped by another vehicle, like an LST, across the reef, but only at the speed of 1 hex per turn. And that's across a prepared path of reefs provided by the engineers preparing the reef. So the anti-tank gun is within the LVT-2, but any other artillery is towed, and therefore is a much more complicated process, and the movement across the reef has to be done slowly and carefully. LCVPs, or the Higgins boats, the classic landing crafts that you can see depicted here on the top right and the middle picture in the bottom. It can carry 4 infantry platoons, 2 jeeps, or 1 anti-tank gun platoon. Alternately, you can mix and match the vehicles in the jeeps. So 1 LCVP could carry, given the ratio, 2 infantry platoons and 1 jeep. So here you have all of the different loadouts presented at the same time. Starting on the left, you've got the LSD with a configuration of 5 ducks and 6 landing vehicle tracks, but that can be reversed to 6 ducks and 5 landing vehicle tracks. In the middle, you've got an LSD with its standard 10 landing vehicle track counters. That's representing 40 total vehicles. And then going to the right at the top, you've got the LCI with 4 infantry platoons, the duck with 3 infantry platoons, the LVT with its 3 different combinations, 2 platoons, 1 jeep, an anti-tank. You've got the 3 configurations for the LCVPs, not including the 2 platoon and 1 jeep, and then you've got the LCI, the LST, with the its combination. And what's not shown here is that those wheeled vehicles can be replaced by artillery, such as mortars, howitzers, and guns. You can see the picture on the right, which is the what a duck looks like, and a duck that was disabled by a landmine. So we've seen the different amphibious landing vehicles. Let's take a look now at how they could land a battalion of Marines on a shore. So here we've got a Marine battalion comprising 3 separate companies and a 4th equivalent company, which is the headquarters and all of the support sections and platoons. So each Marine company comprises 4 infantry platoons, of one of which is the machine gun platoon, and then 2 sections, one of which is heavy weapons, machine guns, and a section of bazookas, 1 platoon of 60mm mortars, and a platoon of jeeps. Now on the top left, this is one configuration. I've got 4 landing vehicle tracks carrying the platoons of infantry, and then the 2 sections. Now recall, 3 sections is the equivalent of 1 platoon, and the jeeps. And so all of this could be landed on 2 separate hexes without exceeding the stacking limit and incurring a attack bonus to a direct or indirect fire onto that hex. On the bottom left, I've got 2 LCVPs. The first LCVP is carrying all 4 of the platoons, and the LCVP, the Higgins boat or the landing craft, landing craft vehicle personnel. On the right is carrying all the remaining support units, including the jeep, the mortar, and the 2 sections. Now, going to the bottom right, we can see 2 ducks that are carrying the different platoons. And ducks cannot carry jeeps, and so we have 1 LVT that is bringing in the jeep. And on the top right, we can see the headquarters company equivalent. You've got the headquarters and the supply platoon, and then you've got the signals platoon and 1 of the 3 81mm mortar platoons, the anti-tank platoon, and then the heavy machine gun section. And again, this can be landed in approximately 2 hexes. So you can read here about the very interesting process of crossing the reef. Essentially, the LVTs led the tanks very slowly across the reef to make sure there were no potholes. The LVT, of course, wouldn't sink into the hole because they were amphibious. And none of the Shermans were apparently lost, and they were all brought to shore within the first hour, and they were present when the Japanese conducted their armored attack. So you can see here the LSDs on the edge disgorging their LVTs and their ducks to land that 1 Marine battalion that we prepared. So this would have to be done essentially 9 times for each of the battalions. And so not all of the elements were landed initially. There was battalions that were kept offshore in reserve in case they had to outflank the Japanese or if there was a particular weakness that could be exploited. This is a side view to give you an idea of how high these counters are. Each of the counters underneath these vehicles represents approximately 1 of the platoons that you saw earlier in the Marine battalion. And this would be the Marine battalion's landing. This is much wider front than historical, but I don't think it's too far off if you do it in separate echelons from the actual tempo of the historical landing, which you can see in the Osprey books map in the bottom right. So here you can see a sort of a full-flung landing. This is a map showing every single landing system. You've got the 4 LSDs off the side of the map disgorging their LVTs and their ducks. You've got LSTs approaching the pioneer units that are preparing a path through the reef. Now you only need an engineering unit on the edge clearing that hex for 12 turns to be able to make it possible for the LCIs and the LSTs to land on that location. Now you can see the LVTs that are moving inshore. Obviously the stacking limit in Panzer Leader is 4 units per hex. If they disgorge all of their passengers while they're stacked 4 high, they're going to incur a very disadvantageous attack bonus for the enemy. So that's obviously an important consideration. The LCVs can, along with the ducks, they can traverse the reef if they follow an LVT. So you can see in the middle of the reef, you can see an LCVP, which is following an LVT. So essentially the LVT is crushing any of the reef that is sticking out that could poke a hole in the bottom of the LCVP. Or the LCVP can cross over a path prepared by the engineers. An LCVP, because it's a landing craft, it can certainly debark on an uncleared reef edge if it had to. And so could a duck. I mean, they basically just sort of drive up to the reef edge, don't go too deep, the people jump off. But you're not going to be able to get jeeps or artillery that can't be carried by individuals across that reef. So it's sort of dangerous. Both LSTs, LCIs require the reef edge to be prepared in order to keep the ship from becoming stuck. on that reef.